Okay, let's get started. This again is Antonia Herzog. I'm with Physicians for Social Responsibility in the Environment and Health Program. I'm the program manager for climate and clean energy, and I'm excited to have you all join us today for this our webinar that we're hosting. The title of it is Why We Must Protect the Clean Air Act Authority and Climate Legislation. We'll be discussing what it means to have well-designed federal policy that will effectively address the threat of climate change and protect our health. We urgently, as you all know, need action as soon as possible, and we need good legislative proposals that will get the job done. Unfortunately, there are efforts underway which could undermine our attempts carbon dioxide pollution. And in particular, what we'll be discussing in this webinar are some problematical provisions that have come up currently and in years past that could weaken or remove EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act to set carbon pollution standards for power plants. So what we've done is we've invited two experts in this area to discuss the background of this issue and what's currently happening in Congress with federal legislation to cut carbon pollution and this problematical provision that gets included and why it is a problem. So we'll start first with Ann Weeks, and then she will be followed by Paul Billings. Ann is Senior Counsel and Legal Director with Clean Air Task Force. She's been there since it began in 1996, and she is widely recognized in her work as a litigator representing environmental nonprofits and health organizations, both in administrative proceedings and in federal court, as part of the campaigns that she's involved in to reduce pollution and mitigate climate change impacts from power plants. Before joining CATF, Ann worked as an attorney with the Energy Program at Conservation Law Foundation and as an associate with the Energy and Environmental Practice at Dixon and Shapiro in the Washington, D.C. office. She also has 10 years of career in environmental and land use planning, culminating in the position as Assistant Director of City County Planning for Durham, North Carolina. And holds a JD from the School of Law at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she was an editor of the North Carolina Law Review. Following Ann, we'll have Paul Billings. Paul Billings is National Senior Vice President of Advocacy. Paul is at the American Lung Association, and in this capacity, he has overseen Lungs Association's asthma, lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, healthy air, and tobacco control advocacy programs. During his tenure at the Lung Association, he's led federal advocacy campaigns that have resulted in stricter regulations on tobacco, growth and research funding, improved patient access to preventative services, and the cleanup of air pollution from power plants and vehicles. Paul has worked at American Lung Association for more than 25 years. So I'm excited to have both Ann and Paul here as part of our webinar to talk about these important issues. Just quickly, a process point. You are all currently on mute, and you will stay on mute throughout the presentation. But if you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the question box that hopefully you shall see on your webinar GoToWebinar screen. And when Ann and Paul are done with their presentations, I will be pulling questions from those that you've entered and posing them to our presenters so that they can answer them. And we will aim to close the webinar at 4 p.m. So at this point, let me change the screen over to Ann. It will take a second to pop up, and then Ann, feel free to start when you're ready. Thank you so much.
Sure, and I'm sorry for the siren. I was going to wait till it went by, but perhaps that is a fitting soundtrack to what we're talking about, which is, why the Clean Air Act, not only as a public health protection tool, but as a climate tool. Why has it worked so far, and what can it do? Just a brief introduction to our organization. It was a lovely introduction. I feel like my life flashed before me when Antonia was presenting. I wanted to note that we represent nonprofit clients around the country, including the American Lung Association, which is why I'm fortunate enough to be asked to do this with you today. We do represent ALA in a number of climate related matters, as well as on some conventional air pollution related work, and I enjoy that collaboration very much. So why the Clean Air Act? I'm not going to read my slides, but I do want to, as we start, just lay out some bullets. We have a lot of experience with this tool. It works. It's facile. There's a relatively short period of time between the decision to act and the action, and there are proven results. The other thing to think about, in addition to this list that I have put up on the screen, is that the Act offers us, and I'll explain further as we go through, the opportunity to target the largest emitters, particularly industries that are not going to move offshore. So that reduces the problem of leakage, so-called, where a state or country regulates a particular industry, and the industry shuts down within that state and moves either overseas or to another state, causing more pollution because of the move and the lack of regulation in the other state or country. So by targeting the largest emitters, which are not going to move because that's not the nature of those industries, we reduce the opportunity for leakage. And the Clean Air Act has that facility. We can do that. The other thing about the Clean Air Act that I want to mention before we start is that, unlike a broad-based tax, these regulations are not regressive. They don't put the burden on the entire population. They put it where it belongs, which is on the polluters, to try to add the economic burden and cost that's associated with the public health issues that climate change brings with it, as well as the associated public health burdens caused by conventional air pollution that's emitted along with the climate pollutants. So I'm going to assume, because I've been told that no one or very few people on this call probably have a legal background, and because I have young adult children, I know that civics is no longer taught in schools very predictably. So I just want to run through the difference before I start going about why the Clean Air Act is a useful tool. I want to explain the difference between a statute and a rule. I'm always interested when I'm out and about to learn that most people just think of the law. They don't think of the distinction between the congressionally written statutory provisions of the law and the regulations or the rules that are written in response to those statutes by the administrative agency charged with writing them. Agencies are controlled by congressional statutes, in addition to being controlled by the administration. So they're an interesting body of expertise. They're meant to be experts, but they're also being directed by the legislative body. So, for an example, if Congress were to require EPA to set standards to control a pollutant to the maximum extent feasible, the agency would have to figure out what that means and set the standard, and would be required to fully analyze the facts. What is the maximum extent feasible, taking into account whatever Congress tells it are the constraints on that analysis? There's a lot of public process and a lot of public input, but it's not a lot of time necessarily. A proposal is often issued in one calendar year and finalized in the next calendar year. and then the rule becomes effective within 60 days after finalization, barring something unusual happening. But that's the normal course of events. Courts then evaluate the rules, if challenged, against what the Congress has said in the statute, what the Congress purpose was in the statute, and if there's any ambiguity, there's a demand for reasoned decision making. So there's a lot of boundaries around this, and there's a lot of ability to act. People will say, oh, that's going to take forever, but when we consider how long it's been since we've been thinking about the climate problem and the fact that we don't yet have any legislation specific to the climate problem, and yet, as you're going to see, we've done a lot on the regulatory front, I think that will illustrate for itself how beneficial this statute can be. So what I was saying before was that the text of the statute is important. And I'm not going to read all of this. The definitions, though, here are not new. They've been part of the Act for quite a long time, some 30 years. And the requirements at the bottom, these regulatory requirements to regulate any air pollutant which causes or contributes to air pollution causing or anticipated to endanger public health or welfare, that's not new language either. It's been around for a long time. It's been in use for a long time. In the case of the regulation of conventional air pollutants. And so there's a 40-year-old and maybe a little more system of words that have been analyzed by the courts that are well understood, that the agency itself has a long history with in the Clean Air Act. So I want to give you a little bit of the history of how we got to where we are now. There was a rulemaking petition to regulate the climate emissions from motor vehicles that wended its way through the courts after being denied by the EPA and wound its way up in the Supreme Court. And I won't go through all of that boring detail for you, but I will say that this was in 2007, so gosh, 12 years ago now. The court agreed with the petitioning states that greenhouse gases meet the capacious is the word, in addition to sweeping definition of air pollutants. There's nothing counterintuitive, said the court, about the idea that EPA can use this tool to curtail emissions that are substances putting the global climate out of kilter. So very straightforward statement that the Clean Air Act covers climate pollution. What the court did not do in Mass versus EPA was direct EPA what to do about that. It said that EPA had to make a decision, which it had been waffling on, and it had to support any decision it made where it had declined to regulate. It would have to tell us why. It would have to say why it cannot or will not exercise its discretion to determine whether these greenhouse gases contribute and why and what the EPA is going to do about it. So that was in 2007. EPA's response was to sit on its hands for a little while, and then we had a regime change. Although, before the regime change, we had a leak. In June 2008, before the election, an EPA employee leaked an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to take comment on just exactly what the agency ought to do and how to respond to this new directive from the court, that these greenhouse gases were in fact air pollutants that needed to be regulated under the Act. EPA took comment on all of that, and as soon as the regime change occurred, issued a proposal and a final rule called the endangerment finding. which was based on really a massive record. EPA's advance notice on that it had leaked. It was really kind of a joke because EPA had all of the information it needed. It had been presented in petitions before, and it had been litigated, as you heard. They wanted to take comment again, and we took the opportunity to give them more information even, so that by the time the endangerment finding was finalized, it was based on really a massive record. And EPA made the determination that carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, and perfluorocarbons, either mixed or in any combination or alone, were air pollutants subject to regulation under the Act. The endangerment finding didn't actually it didn't write any requirements for controlling them. It just simply said that those requirements were now to be developed. So the steps in the process that have taken place at this point, this is in 2009, are the Supreme Court has directed EPA to do something. EPA has responded by saying, yes, these pollutants cause or contribute to endangerment of public health and welfare and should be regulated. That finding, along with the light-duty vehicles rule and the stationary source greenhouse gas air permitting rules, which were subsequently issued in the following year, went up to the Supreme Court and were upheld. The endangerment finding was upheld completely. The vehicles rule was upheld completely. And the stationary source permitting rules were upheld almost entirely. There was one technicality that the court didn't like about the permitting rules, but it left in place the idea that if you're a major source of a stationary source of air pollution, you must also control your greenhouse gases if you're new and getting an air permit, or if you upgrade significantly. Then the court followed on that with, you might remember in 2013, the Obama administration issued a memorandum calling for additional regulation of other sources using the new source performance standards tool. They issued rules for new power plants, existing power plants, that's the Clean Power Plan. New oil and gas production methane emission standards were issued. And also, this is a non-Clean Air Act tool, but the Bureau of Land Management issued regulations saying that there could be no waste of the methane that makes up 80% of natural gas development when oil and gas is produced on federal land. So the Trump administration has now tried to cut the legs out of many of these actions, but I think it's worth pointing out that all of this activity occurred in a 6-year period. So if we need to get significant emissions reductions, as we do, in a relatively short period of time, as we do, we're subsequent to the endangerment finding, we're really ready to move pretty quickly to aim at the largest sources of this pollution. If we get serious, we have a tool. So there's more detail here on the various rules. I took this from another webinar that I did. I'm sorry for the repetition here, but to the extent that you're interested in some of the details of these rules, I'm happy to answer questions about them. I'm just going to scroll through these slides so that if you want them, I'm sure we can make them available. They offer some more information about the fact that the previous rules, so for example, this slide on the court-tested nature of the section of new source performance standards, this is all about conventional air pollution, but there's nothing about conventional air pollution necessarily, that's different or requires a different statute than climate pollution. Climate pollution admittedly is emitted in larger volumes, but there are certainly tools that can be used to reduce it. And the Section 111, new source performance standards not only have a long track record, not only have they been upheld by the courts, but the courts seem to be urging the agency to go further always than they do, than the agency wants to do. So the directive is to look toward the future rather than state of the art at the present. It doesn't, the standards don't have to be met by, the average plant. They want to endorse and embrace and promote technological innovation, which of course is what we have to do if we are going to move out of the status quo into a lower carbon energy system. So that's another reason for thinking about the Clean Air Act, is that we know how to use it, the courts know what it means, and it's possible to do some serious regulation pretty quickly. So these are the existing source standards. Okay, so now here, I'm winding up. Thank you for your patience. I have 2 more slides. I just want to pose the question, and I think Paul will pick up the answers maybe, whether existing federal authority is really enough. We need a lot of CO2e reduction, so equivalent to carbon dioxide if you're reducing other climate forcers by the middle of this century. And the sooner we can get it, the better. Power plants are 40% of the U.S. greenhouse gas problem, and they don't, the electricity system is not going to migrate across into Mexico or Canada. It's existing here. And in fact, what we get from Canada right now is pretty much emission-free, at least in New England where I'm sitting. Oil and gas methane, we know how to control releases up to 95% from various components in that industry. By controlling the methane component of oil and gas production, the companies actually make money, so it's cost effective. Vehicles also are going to be 30% of the problem and provide an opportunity, because not all cars will immediately go overseas. They provide an opportunity to really attack the issue of the problem where it resides here. And other large industrial sources of greenhouse gases also were teed up to be performance standard regulated before we had a change in administration. So you can see in the red bullets on the right-hand side what the reductions would have been. What we know from the history of Section 111B, the new source standards portion of the Act, is that using it, sulfur dioxide emissions were reduced by enormous amounts. Nitrogen oxide emissions were reduced by enormous amounts, like 90–95%. The air we breathe is so much cleaner now. Not that we've gotten where we need to go, but it's so much cleaner now than it was before we had these tools in the Act, through which the administration and the EPA could regulate stationary sources. In summary, I just will close by saying we need an everything plan. I think, well, I'm a strong proponent of using Clean Air Act authority because I think it allows us to act quickly in ways that are well understood and court tested. I think it's more likely to result in the direct regulation of the largest greenhouse gas emitters, which is where the burden belongs. That the other piece that I haven't talked about, but there's a whole separate section of the Clean Air Act that requires regulated industries and vehicles to be tested, vehicles to meet standards before they roll off the line, regulated industries to be annually monitored or sometimes more often, and for that information to be reported and available to the public. the Clean Air Act in yet another section allows attorneys general or even private citizens withstanding. So if you live near a power plant, or if you are particularly affected by climate change, you can sue over the failure to meet a standard. The other thing that happens with the Clean Air Act provisions is that once a rule has been, a technology-based rule has been finalized and is in place, there's also a requirement in the statute that it be revisited periodically, because that way the agency can take advantage of improvements in technology. Has there been developed a cleaner fuel? Is there a cleaner system to use to burn the fuel to make energy, for example? Those have to be factored into periodic reviews. And finally, we know that this works. We have information about it. It's been in place for quite a long time, and we know that it works, and we know that it works from just looking around us in ways that don't break the bank. And I think I'm going to turn this over to Paul right now. He has a nice slide that illustrates that last point very well, I think. And I just want to thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer questions. I don't know. I guess we should wait to the end of the webinar for that, but I'm happy to answer them now if that's the organizer's wish. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you just finished. Thanks very much, Anne. That was great for that excellent background on Clean Air Act authority. And so I think we'll hold questions and let Paul speak and then have questions after that. I hope everybody can find the question box. I got a query about that, but usually there's a little box on the side of your screen with an arrow. Maybe it's been closed, but if you click the little arrow, hopefully it will pop back up and you can put your question in the question comment box. So anyway, moving on to Paul. Paul will talk a little bit more about what's currently happening today with legislative efforts that specifically try and undermine this Clean Air Act authority that Anne just described so well to everyone. So I am going to change over to Paul. Hopefully you can see his presentation now. And so Paul, it's all yours. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Antonia, and thank you for PSR for hosting this webinar. And thank you, Ann Weeks, for teeing this up so well and for all of your great work, including representing the American Lung Association on Clean Air Act litigation. I'm excited to be here with you on a snowy day in Washington to share what I hope will be some valuable insights to start the conversation about why we need to preserve the Clean Air Act, particularly as some of these legislative proposals move forward. I think it's really important from a public health perspective to understand that climate change is happening now. It makes wildfires worse, severe heat waves and air pollution more likely, and we're all bearing the burden, the health burden of climate change. We've seen it in the past 2 summers with these huge wildfires that not only threaten the health of people close by, but all across the country. We were seeing air quality readings that were elevated in Baltimore, Maryland from California wildfires this summer. We also know that more hot days with stagnant air mean more ground level ozone or smog. We know that all of these pollutants can trigger asthma attacks, heart attacks, stroke, and even premature death. Particle pollution is also linked to lung cancer, so it's really important to get this right and to protect public health along the way. And as Ann closed, I want to reiterate where I start. We need to use all of the tools in our toolbox to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and to cut the pollution necessary to the levels that will protect the planet. So this means we need to put a price on carbon, a tax, a fee. It can be an important part of the solution, but it has to be combined with Clean Air Act limits, clean energy investments and incentives, appliance efficiency, cleaning up transportation, electrification, infrastructure improvement. I think it was once again Infrastructure Week here in Washington. I think every week in Washington is Infrastructure Week. Will something happen this year? Unclear, but we certainly want to make sure that a climate-friendly infrastructure package moves forward. And health adaptation. We need to put in place all of the strategies and all the tactics to reduce the pollution that is warming our planet. I also want to begin with a note of caution. And here's President Obama signing the Affordable Care Act back in 2010. And you can see John Dingell, to his right, just passed away. Joe Biden looking over his shoulder with Tom Harkin. Affordable Care Act ultimately passed, and the Supreme Court ruled that the penalty was a tax. And therefore, in 2017, the Republican-controlled Congress repealed the tax in the Affordable Care Act effective in 2020, so that they cut essentially the penalty to zero. They didn't repeal it outright. They cut the level of tax to zero. And then late last year, a Texas court Care Act was unconstitutional because the tax was cut to zero. So there are some perils with a tax-only strategy. This is going through appeal, but understand that every legislative approach is fraught with risks for future legislative actions. So we should be adding tools, not taking it away. I think this is the slide that Ann was teasing a little bit earlier in the presentation. The Clean Air Act has enjoyed tremendous success, and this is an EPA slide that shows how 6 indicators have changed since the 1970 Clean Air Act passed. At the bottom, perhaps most important, is that aggregate emissions from the 6 most common air pollutants have been cut by 73% over that 47-year period for this slide, while at the same time GDP has grown by 262%. So you can see that cleaning up air pollution and growing the economy can go hand in hand. Other indicators like vehicle miles traveled, I'm not sure that's a positive indicator, but it certainly is an indicator of population and activity has increased, population has increased, energy consumption has increased, and CO2 emissions have increased since 1970. So clearly they peaked around 2007 in this chart and are on a downward trend since that peak. I'll also note that in 2011, EPA estimated that in 2020, the Clean Air Act will prevent 230,000 premature deaths in that year alone. Now, it's probably a conservative estimate because of additional pollution control strategies have been implemented since that 2011 estimate, but understand that the Clean Air Act is saving hundreds of thousands of lives each year. I want to talk today about 5 legislative approaches, 5 bills, and 1 plan. A lot of these bills' names sound alike, so I'm going to talk about them generally with the names of their sponsors rather than trying to get out American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act and contrast that with the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And there are certainly some differences between these different bills in their House and Senate version. I'm not going to go into detail or really discuss much at all the level of the fee or the tax or how the funds are distributed or even whether the individual proposals are estimated to be sufficient or what level of reductions of carbon pollution the sponsors and other analysts have estimated will result from if these bills were to become law and be implemented. But I will speak about the provisions that block or repeal Clean Air Act authority and why I think it's really unnecessary for these provisions to be included in legislation. But I'm going to start with the good news. This is a bill that was introduced in the last Congress, a House and Senate bill, and they are identical. In fact, there were 2 different versions, one introduced in 2017 and another version in 2018 because the 2017 bill had provisions related to corporate taxes that were cut by another tax bill that was passed in the last Congress. But important for both these bills, and I'll refer to this as the White House bill, there are no provisions to block or repeal Clean Air Act authority, nor are there any provisions that provide liability protections or immunity to polluters for any of their malfeasance and bad acts. This bill has a carbon fee, it adjusts for inflation, and it applies to a wide range of facilities. The next bill I want to talk about, which was also introduced in the last Congress and has not yet been reintroduced in this Congress, is the Coons Flake bill. And folks know Senator Flake retired from Congress last year, and so this bipartisan bill, Senator Coons is still there, but I think he's looking for a Republican co-sponsor to reintroduce. And these are Senator Coons and Senator Flake's own words from a fact sheet that they prepared on their legislation. So the legislation preserves the authority of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act, and that's really important. What these two bills show, the White House bill and the Coons bill, is it's possible to write a carbon fee or carbon tax or carbon dividend bill that doesn't weaken Clean Air Act protections. And in fact, while the White House bill is silent on it, the fact sheets that Senator Coons and Senator Flake circulated were very explicit about the fact that this bill preserves that authority. The sister bill to this bill, it has the same name, and this is a bill that's been introduced in the 116th Congress, introduced earlier this year, but it had a bill introduced in the last Congress as well by Representative Deutsch and Rooney, and there are also, I believe, 12 additional co-sponsors on this legislation. This is their language. It has pauses the EPA authority to regulate CO2 and equivalent emissions. And if emissions targets are not met after 10 years, then EPA can restart its authority. What this really means is EPA is blocked from implementing the Clean Air Act until after the EPA administrator, whoever she or he may be in 2030, makes a determination about whether or not the bill meets the targets that were outlined in this legislation, not whether the bill and it meets what is necessary to address the climate crisis, but simply whether or not the bill does as it's been designed. So if the IRS sets up this tax and dividend approach, then EPA will have to make a determination if it worked. And then if the EPA administrator determines that the approach did not work in 2030, she or he will have, EPA will then promulgate regulations which will be finalized by 2032. And then the bill says that then those reductions must all be met by 2038. So literally a 20-year delay to get to those reductions, but also essentially putting EPA on the sidelines for a decade and then saying, hey, we made a mess, you've got to clean it up, come and clean it up and fix it really fast by 2038. I'd also note that this is just the opening offer in a piece of legislation. As we'll talk about in a little bit, legislation can change over time, but also it makes the hill steeper and slower to get over to clean the air and to reduce climate change. Another bill was introduced in the last Congress. I'll call this bill the Cabello Bill, and Representative Cabello was defeated in the last election, so I don't know if this bill will be coming back in its exact form, but it also, in their language, from their fact sheet, a performance-based moratorium on finalizing and enforcing Clean Air Act regulations on greenhouse gas emissions. And essentially, in 2025, there is a look back and found if the EPA administrator, whoever she or he may be, makes a determination that the bill is meeting its goals, not meeting what's necessary to address the climate crisis, but meeting its goals, the moratorium continues for 4 more years, and then in 2029, if a determination of the 2020 to 2028 time period, if those goals are met, the moratorium continues until 2033. There is no explicit obligation to act or timeline for implementing rules to clean up the mess if the goals aren't met, let alone whether or not carbon reductions are reduced to the level necessary to address the climate crisis. And then the next, and perhaps the most pernicious approach, is a carbon dividends plan. It's put forward by something called the Climate Leadership Council, sometimes called the Baker-Schultz plan, named after James Baker and George Shultz, former Republican cabinet members. And it's received funding from ExxonMobil. They made their donation and got a lot of press attention for their support of the Climate Leadership Council. This approach calls for the elimination of regulation. So it's essentially a Clean Air Act repeal. It specifically phases out regulations and repeals the Clean Power Plan. And it goes one step further. Part of the approach is protecting companies from federal and state tort liability for their past emissions. Now, I know a little bit about companies that seek civil immunity, because back in the 1990s, the tobacco companies tried this when they were negotiating with state attorneys general and then later with Congress over their bad acts. And they attempted to pass legislation that, among other things, gave them civil liability protection. We were able to block the companies from getting that immunity in that legislation, but unfortunately, then the remaining bill was not able to pass. Though after that legislation, the federal government actually sued the tobacco companies under civil RICO, and tobacco companies were found to be racketeers. And in fact, maybe this past year, some of you have seen the advertisements that were finally running to correct the record for the tobacco industry's part of the resolution of that case. So my cautions about these approaches are we're starting in a process where we're already having folks that in good faith want to address the climate crisis are putting forward efforts to block or delay the Clean Air Act for nearly 2 decades or more than 2 decades in the case of one of the bills. You have an approach from the Climate Leadership Council that wants to repeal all of the Clean Air Act authority to regulate carbon. And this is before we start to move forward with efforts to create additional barriers to implement cleanup. And then you also have this attempt for civil liability shield for polluters. On the right here, we see 4 of the members, and there are about 25 different companies that are members of the Climate Leadership Council. ExxonMobil got a lot of attention for its donations. There's some other big oil companies there. But I also want to point out BP in the lower right corner. BP spent more than $11 million in Washington State this past year in an effort to defeat Washington State's carbon fee ballot initiative. And unfortunately, BP was part of the winning campaign in Washington State. So what's different about the approach that BP spent $11 million to oppose in Washington and their supposed support for the Climate Leadership Council approach? Well, the Washington State proposal didn't provide any civil liability protection and didn't repeal the Clean Air Act. So you have to ask yourself, are the oil companies supporting this effort because they care about climate change and the enormous toll and the threat to our very existence? Or are they really trying to use this as a pathway to get out from under future regulation from EPA under the Clean Air Act and to get civil liability protection from the courts as they are now facing litigation from states and others for their past bad behavior? A couple things also to be worried about as climate legislation moves forward. There will be efforts, I'm sure, to preempt local, state, or regional authority to address climate change. Some of these bills, including, to their credit, the Deutsch Bill and the Coons Bill, have explicit language preserving state and local authority. Other bills do not have that explicit language, but I am certain we'll see as we move through the legislative process efforts to sidetrack and block and repeal efforts like the RGGI program in the Northeast or other state and local efforts to address climate change. We'll continue to see efforts to repeal Clean Air Act authority as these delays and blocks move to permanent repeal. And we'll also, I'm certain, see carve-outs, exemptions, accounting games, inventory games, a lot of other things designed to advantage the powerful polluters at the expense of public health, and trying to find ways to limit their burden to comply with a tax rule or a EPA Clean Air Act implementation rule. I'll point out that corporations are great at not paying taxes. So if we put a tax scheme forward, we need to be very careful we have guardrails and safeguards in place. I'm sure some of you read recently that big companies like Amazon and Netflix have avoided paying any federal income tax for the last few years. Think about what tax lawyers will try to do to escape meaningful cleanup and requirements under a tax regime that doesn't have the Clean Air Act standing side by side to ensure that reductions are occurring. So where does that leave us? We need to keep focused on the goal, and the goal is to cut carbon pollution. We need to think about the power of and. This should not be a choice between putting a price on carbon or the Clean Air Act. It should be both. These strategies can be complementary. In fact, there's a historic precedent in the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act went after chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, in 1990. At the same time period, an excise tax was placed on chlorofluorocarbons, and we saw the phase out of chlorofluorocarbons in the 90s happen much more quickly than all of us hoped it would have occurred. We want to make sure that we see investment and incentives for clean energy. We want to strengthen efficiency for appliance, transportation, buildings, all sources. We want to continue to push for electrification and move away from combustion. Invest in infrastructure improvements, especially infrastructure improvements that reduce the climate burden that's being imposed by our infrastructure. We want to see investment in health priorities and health adaptation, ensuring the cleanup of other pollutants alongside carbon pollution. We can have some win-win approaches where we can reduce not only carbon dioxide, but sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides from power plants side by side. This will save lives near and far away from those power plants and from all sources. So I know I've gone through these slides quickly, and I know that I imagine you have some questions, so I'm happy to stop here and thank you for your attention. And Antonio, turn it back to you as we look forward to the question and answer portion of the call.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. And again, thank you, Anne, for your earlier presentation. That was both a great overview of the background and also the current legislative efforts. So we have a few minutes still for questions. If you have a question, do feel free to enter it into the question box. I do have a few questions lined up, so let me start with those. The first question I have here, and Anne or Paul, feel free to jump in to answer any of the questions. For those of us who aren't that familiar with the particular bills, how do these proposed bills align with carbon tax efforts pushed by grassroots groups like the Citizens Climate Lobby, often called CCL, as well? Who would like to take that one?
I'll start, and then maybe Anne, if you want to fill in. So I think that one of the bills that CCL has been advocating for is that Deutsch-Rooney bill that blocks the Clean Air Act until at least 2030 and wouldn't allow regs until 2032. Interestingly, CCL, I believe, also supported the Coons Flake bill, which did not include that provision.
Okay, great, thank you.
I would just say, sorry, this is Ann, I'm just getting off mute here. I would just say, whatever we do, we don't have 10 years to wait around to do it. And my observation about the Clean Air Act is we've already come a long way in the last 10 years. We could come a similar good distance in the next 10 years, but certainly not if Congress blocks it.
Okay, thank you. Taking even a step back from that, here's another question. How does the Clean Air Act mesh with the Green New Deal?
I don't think there's anything inconsistent between what I've seen of the Green New Deal and the Clean Air Act. Of course, the Green New Deal is a resolution. It's not a piece of legislation. It's not a proposed statute even. It directs the development of more specific elements. It's not unlike what we saw on the administrative side from the Obama administration in 2013. You might remember that he put out this memorandum and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take some action. And he listed a whole collection of desired actions and then set about to do them. The Green New Deal is basically, we need to start working on this. Here are some principles that we stand for in moving forward. But it doesn't say anything about whether or not moving forward requires Clean Air Act rules or new legislation or some combination thereof. It's a resolution, it's not a statute. So I think that the real answer is there's no conflict, and we just have to work on the actions that come next. I think what we all agree is that we need every tool in the toolbox, and we need not to be giving any of them away. And that, I think, is consistent with at least the climate portions of the Green New Deal. Paul, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Well, the Green New Deal, it is a broad statement of support for many things. Clean air is clearly an important part of it, as is addressing climate change. I would say that the things that I outlined, the things that Anne outlined in her statement, are very consistent with the language of the Green New Deal, calling for not only cleaning up air and water, but improving infrastructure and energy efficiency and cutting the emissions that contribute to climate change. So I think that there's a lot of synergy between the Green New Deal and using these Clean Air Act tools and strengthening and adopting additional tools to address climate change, improve public health, and many other things in the Green New Deal.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Here's another question. Why has the, preempting Clean Air Act authority become such a negotiating chip? And is there a legislative process that either of you would recommend? And have you ever seen, it's a sort of multi-part question, have you ever seen legislation get stronger over time?
Wow, a couple different questions there. So I'm not sure why the Clean Air Act has become a negotiating chip. I think it's probably because the Clean Air Act is such a powerful public health law and has a tremendous record of success, but along the way it has annoyed the polluters because it's forced them to do things they did not want to do along the way. So since 1995, the Clean Air Act has had a big bullseye on its back, as there have been attempts to repeal it outright or repeal a specific provision in the last 25 years. Though the Clean Air Act in 1990 passed with overwhelming bipartisan support.
I would just
and one
add
other point I'd like
that
to make is
industry doesn't like things that cause it to have to spend money to clean itself up. So that's why, because it works, just to echo Paul.
Yeah, I would say that generally in legislative processes, yes, as bills move their way through, they compromise, and that's not the dirty word that some think it is. The provisions can be changed and relaxed. But in the 80s, I would also point out that the provisions around SO2 and the levels of reduction of SO2 got stronger through various iterations of clean air legislation prior to the bill that passed in 1990. So bills that were proposed in the earlier 80s had higher levels of SO2. But I would also point out in the ensuing 29 years since the Clean Air Act of 1990 passed, we have far exceeded the reduction envisioned by the cap and trade system on SO2 because of other provisions of the Clean Air Act, including rules like the mercury and air toxic standards, which provided additional reductions of SO2 because of the pollution controls installed to meet the MATS requirements.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's see, here's another question. I'm not sure, it might be our last question since we're starting to run out of time. But this person, thank you both for your excellent presentations. Yesterday in the Washington Post, I think, it was reported that the administration EPA is becoming open to adopting our MESIS model that counters the linear non-threshold that has guided radioactive regulation, potentially for considering the impacts of all other toxins. Wondering if this has implications for the Clean Air Act EPA regulatory authority. If either of you are familiar with that.
Yes, there's a big story in the LA Times about some of the scientists, I use that in air quotes, I'm not sure they're really real scientists who promote some of these theories. And we're seeing this conversation come in the regulation of toxic pollution, as well as I think we're going to see an attempt to see this argument made as EPA is working through the process to look at the reviews of the ozone and particulate matter standards as well. So these corporate, air quote, scientists, close quote, support these theories that are far outside the mainstream, and essentially, you know, at the end of the day, what they say that pollution is good for you, and that runs counter to, you know, a well-established body of work that shows that harms for these pollutants there's no threshold for harm from these pollutants.
Yeah, just to put a slightly finer point on it through the Clean Air Act lens, when you regulate climate air pollution from, for example, a power plant, you necessarily control other pollutants at the same time. And what these theories would do would be to say that you can only count the benefits of doing that, the public health benefits of controlling particulates along with carbon dioxide, up to the point where the national standard for particulate matter sits, because any reductions of particulate matter below that national standard don't really count, because there's this theoretical idea that low levels of pollution are actually okay for you, even though EPA's own record in setting the standards for particulate matter show that there are incredible health harms, even by exposures, even through exposure below that threshold level. So basically the argument is, it's, you know, lower levels, don't worry about those lower levels of air pollution, they're not really bad for you. And by the way, we're not going to count them in considering how good a regulation or how beneficial a regulation is for public health. So that definitely impacts our ability to argue that standards are cost effective, because we know that climate standards will also decrease harmful conventional air pollutants below the NAAQS levels from these sources. And so not only will that benefit all of us, it will most particularly, no pun intended, benefit the people who live in and around and near coal-fired power plants, because those are the people who most experience the negative effects of that conventional air pollution that goes along with burning coal.
Okay, well, we've reached our time, 4 o'clock, so I'm going to draw the webinar to a close. Again, many thanks to Ann Weeks and Paul Billings for joining us and sharing their expertise. The webinar has been recorded, and you will all be receiving a link, which you should feel free to share with others who may not have been able to join. Again, the point of the webinar was just to educate folks a little bit more about Clean Air Act authority, and to realize that there are these legislative proposals out there now, currently, that you may be hearing about from other groups and organizations that you work with, which have some problematical provisions in them and that are trying to remove or undercut this Clean Air Act authority, which has been such a useful tool for reducing our climate and air pollutants over the years. So thank you again, and have a good day and rest of your week. Goodbye.